Oh, hello. So you've come a long way, young Padawan, and congratulations for making it this far, if you have. If you're just leaping in here from the middle of nowhere and you haven't gone and looked at the previous Agile series, then you might find this is a little bit weird. But if you have been keeping up, then this should make some sense. So what I'm going to cover today is something which is incredibly simple and yet incredibly not. Kanban, right? And some of the lean principles. So just pulling you back to the previous sessions, and I was talking about how there comes a point where you have to look at what Scrum is for, which is very much exploring and discovery and rapid feedback right through that cadence. And look at, well, what happens when it's a bit slower, it's a bit more, there's like a lot of knowns, and there's a lot of work where we kind of know what we should be doing. This is particularly true when you hit something like production stage, if you have a production stage, and we'll talk about stages elsewhere. And you just have a massive list of work to do, right? And you're like, well, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, so I don't really need that kind of 2 weekly sprint cadence in order to explore complex and complicated work and give lots of information feedback. What I really need is to get on with it. And I find this is particularly true with the poor artists and animators and people like this, right? Who just end up with this huge bucket list of, here you go and do that, you know. And it's kind of after most of the questions have been answered, it's just, well, look, we've just got a year and a half's work to do. Let's get on with it. Now, Scrum, as I keep saying, isn't necessarily the right place, right methodology. It's perfect for Kanban. And hey, look, I even say here, perfect for Kanban. Chaotic demands from all directions, but the plan evolves and develops over time. And what I mean by that is, say the art team, you have a big backlog of work. You can assign it and you can just crack on. And every day you pretty much know what you're doing and that something's in the queue for you to pull and just do next, right? You're not that bothered by what's going on around you and perhaps the chaos and tears and, horrors of game development that are going on elsewhere. You're just like, yeah, it's cool. I can't believe, by the way, that no one's corrected my spelling mistake here. Were you not paying attention? That's outrageous. There you go. Oh, hang on. But yeah, stop moving. Right, that's good. But sorry, there's something happening outside. Yeah, the Kanban methodology says that kind of quiet life where somebody just wants to know what to do next and pull the next bit of work is what it supports, right? But it also lets you have the bigger picture of, well, what is that next piece of work? And how long did it take you to do the last piece of work? And what should the prioritization actually be, and how are we going to determine that? And it measures more a flow across a board or flow across a workflow system. It measures that flow rather than attempts to say, commit to a bunch of work for the next 2 weeks, which hardly anyone bloody does anyway. Let's face it, if you're using Scrum, it's a bunch of liars. If you say you are, hardly anyone does that. Anyway, so Kanban, let's just look at what it is, right? And I'm following through on what I said I'd talk about, but obviously I'll go way off tangent as well. You could argue, well, Kanban is just the Kanban board, right? It's just that Kanban board that you have in Jira, for example, which is like a bunch of rows, or Trello or Favro or whatever, where it's just a bunch of rows and columns, like, usually a bunch of columns in one row. And that's it, right? And that's a Kanban board, because Kanban means card in Japanese, so it's just a board full of cards, right? Well, no. It's a bunch of columns isn't a Kanban board, right? That's just a bunch of columns. If it's got some cards on it tracking work progress, it's still not a Kanban board. It's just a bunch of columns with some cards on it tracking progress. That's not Kanban. Kanban is very, very complicated and complex itself if you dive down the rabbit holes And it comes up with some sexy Japanese words like Kaizen as well, which is like continuous improvement. And it has a whole philosophy behind it. And it is agile, comes from, it's part of it developed within the agile principles. And while it has come from the work of the Japanese Toyota production system, in recent years, the sort of lean software development and the work of people like Anderson, who wrote the book on Kanban, called Kanban, which was a good title for a book. That's all been kind of through, say, Microsoft. I mean, Anderson was working at Microsoft, and he was like, how do I get this working? How do I get this great Kanban stuff that the Japanese have done with the Toyota production system? How do we translate that to software? Could we? Should we? Could it work? Yeah, it seems like it can, and seems like it should. Seems like it's a good idea. And people who use Kanban, I'll come back to this later, but people who use it properly and understand what it is, have marked improvements in a whole bunch of metrics. I mean, I've got whole infographics and fact sheets on this stuff, but there's a whole lot of perks, right, and benefits to using Kanban if you do it properly. And so it's more than just the board. Anyway, here we go. I'm sort of faffing around on this because it's a difficult topic, right? I did a bunch of prep in my head, and then I thought there's no point really, because actually there's some websites that have done it all for me, and I'm actually just going to use them and paraphrase them. And there are some tools, some Kanban tools out there which have kind of done it for me too. So I don't see why I should do it all again. And I'm mainly going to be referencing off Kanbanize. So Kanbanize, I actually became a solution partner, like reselling Kanbanize, a couple of weeks back because I was so impressed with it. I saw it a few years ago and I've just reviewed it again. And yeah, so if you do end up wanting to buy it, do it through me so I get some money out of it. But it is brilliant, right? And it's much better than a lot of the other software out there because they don't really understand what Kanban is, whereas Kanbanize does. So I'm going to use a lot of the information from Kanbanize. I'm going to switch over to them. They have loads and loads of information about, what's a Kanban board, how to use it. I've got to say, you might as well just go to Kanbanize, look at their resources and go through this yourself, right? If you want a proper view. They cover a lot. They cover a huge amount of detail around what Kanban is and how to use it and how to use Kanbanize, etc. Right? It's really interesting, and they've got some real interesting information up here as well with the solutions by industry. Their software development one is fantastic, right? It's a fantastic written piece about how they use Kanban in software development in Kanbanize. That's incredibly interesting and useful and covers a lot of topics that a lot of you will be really interested in. But for now, let's just look at it. Okay, so Kanban, right? Yeah, means card. Great. It's a visual scheduling system, as it says here. And I'm sure you all know what Kanban is hypothetically, right? To a degree, you've all gone, yeah, we know Kanban is. Yeah, it's this requested in progress done thing that you can see here, right? It's this. This is what it is. But it's like, well, no, that's just some cards which represent work visualized, okay? And this is a huge piece of Kanban, is visualizing work. But actually, let's have a look at what this Kanban board actually is. So the work in progress limit or work in process limit that you see here, 3 out of 4 in the yellow, is a huge piece that makes a Kanban methodology real. You cannot have a board being a Kanban board if it doesn't have WIP limits, okay? WIP limits mean how many cards can be in that column. So if it's 4 and you've got 3 in the column, you can put 1 more in there. If you've got 4 in there, you can't put another one in there, right? It's a limit. And it's a limit that evolves over time and you learn what those limits should be. And they usually average out. For some teams, they'll be like twice the number of people on the team or something like that, right? For some of these columns. It depends. We'll talk about it. But what you do is you say, well, in each of the columns that I describe your workflow, you say there's only so many cards, work, that can be in there, or tasks, right, that can be in there at any one time. Why? Because of queuing theory, because of science. And we'll have to cover that later. But take my word for it, there's a really good reason. And at the moment, I just want to talk through like what makes a Kanban board, right? Columns. So obviously you need columns. What's a column? It goes from left to right, and it describes a process of flow from left to right, yeah? And it's usually work's been requested, right? So maybe that's a backlog of work. That after it's, like maybe there's been requests, those requests have been analyzed, they've been moved to a backlog's been prioritized, and then you pull things onto the in progress columns. In this case, we have one called in progress, and that can be broken down right into many different stages. But you can say in progress, we have this many cards. And then when they're done, you have a done column that goes, right, we're finished with that, it's done. So again, you can't just have the columns, you need the WIP limits. Now the WIP limit is usually in the in progress area, because it would be pretty weird to have it in the requested area or the done area. What's a card? So, a card is, I'm going to say some work, right? It's a job. There's a job that needs to be done, and the card describes it. And it can be anything, and it can be of any size and whatever, and any, when I say any size, don't shout at me, I'll go back on that one. But it can be any size, it can be like anything, as long as for your team or for that board, it makes sense and it can be standardized. So for example, if you are a web team, right, and you're working in games, but what you do is you update content on the web, and your work tends to be pretty fast work, right? It tends to be pretty like, that's going to take an hour or an hour or two or whatever. And the sort of scale of work you do is very fast. I'm not saying it is, but let's say it is. Then your cards might reflect that. Your cards might be quite small scale, detailed, like bang, 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 bang. But it's still important to track them individually, because each one might reflect, say, a request that's come in from a different gaming department because of stuff that's changed, and therefore the web site that's out, facing out to the players needs to be updated quite frequently, or maybe around a big update or something like that. And you have a whole bunch of cards flowing in saying, do all this work, and you say, great, okay, let's go, and that's your scale. It could be that you're a development, say an engineering department, and you're using Kanban, and the scale of work is far bigger, right? It could be that you have a kind of a small, medium, large label on each card just to help, but that each card is a pretty up to a week, let's say, of work, right? Something like that per card, between say half a week and a week per card, let's say is medium, right? And again, we'll come back to the sizing because that's really an important part of queuing theory, but the card has been broken down intentionally to be of a similar scale to other cards around it. And if you don't do that, then you can never use this properly, because a Kanban board uses science and data, right? It uses data and science to measure how this is all going, and it reports back to you, and it does a whole bunch of statistical analysis, and then it reports back on you and says, right, okay, well, it looks like your medium-sized cards that flow through this system take 8 days to do 80% of the time. So you've got an 80% chance or probability, right, of getting it done in that amount of time. If somebody comes along and says, how long is it going to take, do you think, to do this job? You can go, well, on average, it takes, say, 9 days that 95% of these tasks are done of this size, comparably, statistically. Okay, so the data and the stats and the science is all very important, and you have to use it properly. If you just chuck in cards, and I've seen this, and I've done it myself, right, in the early days when I was the Padawan, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I would just chuck in cards that were any size and go, this is weird, isn't it? I've got like one that is an hour's work here and one that's a month's work, and they're next to each other. You're like, no, that's not what you do. So Then you have swim lanes. And you've probably come across swim lanes, like even if you use Jira or whatever, there's swim lanes where something like expedite. So a swim lane is where you've split the columns, right? And if you've got a good Kanban system like Kanbanize, then it will split the columns even within columns, right? You can have a swim lane that's just in this bit here, not in this bit here, and whatever. But in most cases, it's quite simplistic, and your swim lane tends to just be an entire row with the same columns in each row, right? This one is expedite, and expedite, as you probably are aware, means everyone stop what you're doing and work on this thing here because it's incredibly important. Just so we get this out of the way now, that means you can't have everything being incredibly important and urgent, right? Because that's just called normal, right? What this is the really incredibly urgent stuff that you just, whoever's available stops what they're doing and just gets this thing done. So it's something like if you've got a live game and suddenly it's not live anymore because some horrible things happen to your servers, or someone's forgotten to pay the bill, then that's an expedite. That's like, you just have to react now. Just stop everything else you're doing. This is too important. The more you make an expedite normal in your company, the more things will become just flooding through expedite, and it will remove its meaning. So Kanban boards, right? No, they're not a Kanban board unless you have those things in them, right? Otherwise, it's just not. So, all right. Types of Kanban boards and benefits and whatever. Yeah, okay. Let's just go through some of this stuff here, right? So visualize your workflow. So a workflow is a left to right. Yeah, it's requested, in progress, done. And you'll know this if you've ever done any production which involves project management, like I'm sure most of you have, that you're going to have, you will have broken down, at least in progress, into multiple columns, won't you? You might have done the classic of do all the development, then hand it over to QA. Bye. All right, it's in QA. Great. And that might be your extra column is in testing. Or you might have broken up requested, right? You might have said, particularly if it's high level work, you might have broken that down into a request has come in, the analysis of the request, and then maybe feedback on the request and what you're going to do with it, and just broken it down into more and more complexity. And if that's what you need to do, right, so that you can just see, oh, it's here, it's here, it's there, and you can split these columns up as much as you like. And there's a whole bunch of advice on how to do that on Kanbanize, and I'll give you some as well. But what I'm trying to do here is kind of be relatively brief, but also useful. So yeah, okay. So the workflow goes from left to right, and that's important. Okay. You can spot workflow bottlenecks on here. So how can you do that then? And so this is one of the reasons you use Kanban, right? Is you can see here you've got your work in progress limits, right? So we've got here in progress 4 out of 5, and we've got waiting 3 out of 3, right? So 3 out of 3 are waiting. So you can look at those and you go, well, why are they waiting? And you go, well, okay, there's blockers. And you can use visual cues, etc., to make it clear that there are blockers. But in this case, we're looking at bottlenecks. So what we're doing here is we're saying, why are we waiting and how long have we been waiting? So let's say Alan, poor old Alan, to pick on Alan, configure new routers, right? Until they configure those damn routers, we can't do a bloody thing. Why are we waiting so long? Well, Alan actually, I don't know, is maybe on holiday for the next 4 weeks and no one told you. Does that sound familiar, by the way? So Alan might be gone, right? And you might need to move it to somebody else and whatever. But if you just have a waiting column, even that, you can spot a bottleneck, right? But you can, more usefully, you can use icons. You can use like automated ways of tracking these things to say, right, we only want things to stay in that column for at most 2 days, and then we're going to flag it. We're going to send ourselves a message and say we need to work out like what to do about this because it's holding us up. But a bottleneck in the system is it's a very popular way of optimizing workflows is to spot bottlenecks. And a bottleneck tends to be, when you're dealing with knowledge workers like we are, it tends to be that there is a person who can't do the work you need them to do, and it's holding up everything else. Everything else is dependent on it. And a classic example from my past is where you have, say, an art director, and the art director has said, I want to quality check every piece of art that's come in from the outsourcers. And you say, okay, that's fine. There are 50 this week, so can you get on with it? And they go, oh, well, I haven't actually got any time to do that. And then you'll find that 50 assets are sat there waiting for the quality check by the art director. That's a bottleneck. And in this case, the person becomes a bottleneck. And in lean software development, there is a great deal of literature around these people who are bottlenecks, right? It doesn't just have to be a person, but it is a big thing for knowledge work, because you tend to find that there are specialists and there are also approval sort of flows where these bottlenecks can appear. And one of the beauties of a system like this is that it measures the flow through the system. So how long did it take for a car to flow from left to right? But also, while that flow was happening, how long did it spend in each of these columns? And if you say, well, that's weird because this type of work always tends to stop in this column here for way too long, and that means that rather than flowing in 5 days, that kind of task always takes 20 days. It's taking 15 days. It's just sat there. Then what you've done is you've identified a bottleneck, potentially, and you've also identified waste, okay? And waste is a really big thing. And some of this terminology comes from like the factory floor and warehouse type of production, right? Inventory and things like that, making cars and whatever, right? And those kind of hardware products. Because that's where this comes from. I mean, that's just the background. So some of the terminology is like that. Just like, in management, a lot of the terminology is military or sport, because again, that's where a lot of it comes from. So that's the lexicon is it tends to be around there. So yeah, a bottleneck, so if you were on a factory floor, the bottleneck would be everything's piling up, trying to go through the next bit of this factory floor conveyor belt, and it's all backing up because it's all stuck in one place, right? It's just piling up. That's the same thing here. So you can easily spot things like that. And that makes it quite powerful, because it's not just that you spot it, it's that you measure it, and that it becomes something where you go, oh, that's interesting, because over time, we're making levels. We've got 80 levels to make, and we can see that we've done 20. And in each case, there's a huge amount of like bottlenecking here and waste here, and we can do something about that. So it forces you, if you do your job right, to look at what's wrong and try and do something about it. And that's the entire sort of philosophy behind what, like Kaizen, which is continuous improvement, right? It's the entire philosophy behind continuous improvement of just look at where you are, and one little step at a time, try and knock out like bottlenecks and problems and waste and whatever, and just improve a little bit at a time, right? And you can see here as well that because it's all visualized, people are pretty empowered, because anyone can come and see this stuff, and anyone can go, well, I've spotted a problem, let's do something about it. It's it's very open to that. It democratizes, and again, that's based upon the Toyota production system idea that anybody can like stop the entire flow, right? They can stop the entire factory at any point by like going, right, stop, pull on that chain, and bang, it all stops. And at the same time, anybody on the factory floor can take responsibility for an improvement idea and improve things. And in fact, they're encouraged to, right? So limiting work in progress. This is a huge topic, right? Work in progress, or work in process, as Anderson used to call it, is massive, right? Is a massive topic, because the science behind it, like I say, comes from queuing theory, comes from all manner of exploratory work and scientific discoveries and so on and so forth, which have been applied to mathematics and to statistics and blah, blah, blah. none of which I particularly want to go into right now. But take my word for it, work in progress, what it does is it stops the overwhelm of work, right, that you get otherwise. So what is your team looking like, right? They get loads of work and all they ever see is this mass of work that's expecting, that is waiting for them. And it's like there's never any time to breathe, right? It's just, oh my God, we've committed to every 2 weeks, we've committed to this huge amount of work to do. Or there's this just huge, chaotic, blinding mass of work that we need to do. And they just, they're just losing their minds because of it. When you have a logical analysis taking place by your team of your workflow, they can say to you, well, actually, it would make sense if in this column, we only really had this many cards happening at once, because there's only a few of us who can deal with that. So you might say, I don't know, writing automated testing or something like that, or whatever. You might say, well, there's only 2 of us who can do that. So we can never really have more than 2 cards at once in there. And what that reveals is a natural limitation, right? But also a natural kind of, let's say, a narrowing in the river. If you see this as a river flowing from left to right, where if you just pile too much shit in there, all that's happening is that they can't do their job and they're less effective, and you're splitting their time too drastically, and it doesn't have longevity. It's just going to burn them out. And so work in progress says, well, let's limit how many tasks we can perform simultaneously as a team. So let's say you've got 4 environment artists in a team and they're working on environments. Rather than just saying you can have, 30 bits of work in progress, what you say is, well, there's only 4 of you. So considering that some work might pause temporarily, let's just say you have a work in progress of, say, 4 or 8, right? Just somewhere between 4 and 8. And we'll see how that works. But if any work is waiting to come in and that WIP limit is full, you can't pull it in because you can never exceed that number. Never's a big word. Don't quote me on that, but you should never exceed it. If you have to, Kanban's very open. Kanban says, it's fine. If you have to do that every now and again, that's life, right? Don't be constrained by the system. The system serves you to make your life easier. So don't be a slave to it. Just use the science behind it to make your life easier. And the science in queuing theory here says, if you have natural points of saying, we're not moving any more into this queue, into this bit of the queue, science has proven, as has statistics too, that mathematically, this is much more effective for controlling work and flowing work and not killing everybody. It's actually, you'll get more done and you'll have far more sane team members producing higher quality work faster than if you do it another way. And this has been proven again and again and again, because the WIP limit says we're not going to kill you and we're not going to be falling for these problems that others fall for, where you give somebody so many tasks to do concurrently that you get into that curve which says you can only do so many things at once before you become completely useless, right? So it says, well, no, we're not going to allow that to happen. You're going to work on one thing at once, let's say, possibly 2 if one of them looks like it's waiting for somebody else, let's say, but that's it, right? And if you've got nothing to do, if your work's stuck, the best thing you can do is be T-shaped enough to go and pull something else from the ready to start. But again, only if there's room, right? Only if there's room in the next column. There's a reason for that. And when you come to the point where you go, well, hang on, I can't pull anything into any of these columns. It's completely blocked and stuck. That's when you, the person working in the team, goes, well, okay, well, let's see then. Let's go and have a look. Can I help unblock? Can I learn something here, a new skill? Can I go and do some training? Can I whatever? And rather than forcing them to have 100% work at all times, they can actually breathe a little bit and go, oh, do you know what? I think I'm going to do some planning, or I think I'm going to do some of that other stuff I was meaning to do. And that's kind of built into this because you never plan for 100%. There's that 80% golden rule where 80% capacity is just quite enough. And I'm skipping around a lot, right, when it comes to explaining this in great detail because it's too big right now to do that. But you're going to get the detail. So this thing here, right? Keep every team focused on finishing work instead of starting a new one. What that means is you want to get things done. You want to pull things from the right, from the left to the right, okay? And when you actually do like a stand-up ceremony, which you absolutely do in Kanban, you can do, right? You start at the, say on here, you start at the review and you see, can I pull it into done? And then you go to the left and say, can I pull anything from waiting into review? Can I pull anything from working into waiting? Can I pull anything from ready to start into working? Okay, and it's all by WIP limit. So you would say, well, we can't pull anything, we can pull working into review if it's that, if it's ready for review, because review's only got 1 out of 3 in it. All right. But if you did do that and it was 2 out of 3, then you pulled another one and it was 3 out of 3, then that's it, right? There's enough in review. You can't handle any more in review. So go and do something else. But the emphasis is on finishing work, because as soon as it's done, you're properly able to move on to something else. And that's why mapping your workflow is so important, because done means done, right? It doesn't mean we've released it, but we know there's going to be a lot of work to do on it, and therefore it's not really done, because that should be part of your workflow. What it means is we're done, right? And if anything needs to be done on that thing again, we're going to put a new card up. And that's what you're doing. You're flowing from left to right. And in all cases, you want to flow from left to right, right? You don't want to pull things back and move them like from review back into working, right? You want to avoid that at all costs. And we'll talk about how to do that at some point. So use the Kanban dashboard to save time wasted on unnecessary meetings. Why? Because you can see everything, right? It's visualized. And the cards have enough detail that rather than somebody having to come and interrupt you all the time and say, what's going on with that one? They can go and have a look at the cards and the details are there, okay? So you can use it as a reporting system. Visualise work blockers on your Kanban board. Now, you remember we talked about bottlenecks, but there's also, you can just have pure blocked cards, right? So you can say, okay, X is blocked by Y. Very much like you can say X is dependent on Y. You can say it's blocked. And you can just visualize that as blocked, right, on all these Kanban systems. And if we have a quick look at this example of a board, you can see that the in progress has now been expanded, right? So in progress is that color bar yellow, okay? So it's not just in progress, but it encompasses review and publish deploy, okay? And you can see that they've just added more columns, and that this review columns was split in two, ready for review and in review. Now, that's really useful because otherwise you don't know if something that's ready for review is actually being reviewed. And you can do this quite a lot, right? You can break things down like with sub-columns quite a lot. So, I mean, you could have a third column, couldn't you? You could have a review completed, because then you can determine if you can then pull it over into publish deploy. Now, it could be that in their case, they have an automated system in which if something's completed review, it automatically gets pulled into publish deploy, and actually deployed. So it depends, right? You can automate loads of stuff. So here we have expedite as well and planned work. So there's a blocked in expedite. That's pretty serious. So a blocked status is very interesting because it's going to stay there and it's going to cause you problems until you unblock it. But it's also something that you can measure later when you look at flow statistics. you can look at when these blocks occurred, and you can look at how long, again, cards sat somewhere. But the other interesting thing that makes blocks really interesting, to me anyway, is that you can have multiple linked Kanban boards. So if you have 8 teams and they each have a Kanban board, the blocked here can easily be mirrored in some other team where the block is holding them up as well, or where they can unblock. So you can mirror cards in other team boards, and you should. And you can also create cards to unblock. So you can say, we're creating a piece of work in team 4 because team 8 has got a block and it's expediting and we need to deal with it. So that kind of tracking and tracing across different teams and different boards is very, very powerful. Automate work processes. So I'm not going to go into that particularly because that's really a Kanbanize thing. But metrics. So when you put Kanban in place, and you don't have enough knowledge yet to do that, but when you do, you'll find that there's a whole bunch of interesting things that are different from Scrum. Dramatic pause. With Scrum, what are you dealing with? You're dealing with committing to a bunch of work, and then 2-3 weeks later, whatever, you say, okay, here's how we did. And that becomes predictable, doesn't it? It's your velocity. Why is it velocity? It's because it's speed. It's saying we moved work across from this big lump over here, which was our backlog, our sprint backlog. We moved it over to here, done. And each of them took different amounts of time, and we can track all of that. And basically, though, it shows, forget about like the cumulative stuff. If you just look at it, we got from here to here in 2 weeks. We did it all. And our velocity can be measured through, say, story points, if you're using that, to say, on average, over the last year, we tend to get through 100 story points in 3 weeks, which is our cadence. So we generally commit to 100 story points or less, right? Not more. And as time goes by, we get more and more efficient, maybe, or maybe a team member leaves, another one comes along and we drop for a bit, or maybe we encounter, a little bit of problems and it goes down a little bit. Maybe we gamify it and blah, blah, blah. But so what that tells you is how much work can I commit to? And if you're a producer, it's how much work can my team commit to for, say, the next 3 weeks? 100 story points. Okay. And then you estimate, right? Don't you? You do the planning at the beginning. You say, let's estimate. And you say, okay, right, so I think we've got there. And over time, what happens is that it really does get gamified because the team understand that they don't want to put too much pressure on themselves. They tend to say overestimate. And then those story points means that they make sure they can complete the work by the end of those 3 weeks, because everyone wants to do that, right? Nobody wants to fail. So you tend to find over time there are some problems that need to be addressed in retros where the team warps fact, right? Because they don't want to disappoint anybody, et cetera, right? There's lots of reasons for doing that. But it's almost like it encourages gamification. It encourages cognitive, I'm going to call it cognitive dissonance. It's not really, but it encourages that kind of warping of fact, which is interesting, right? Because you put a lot of effort into estimating. And so it's interesting that those kind of problems occur over time. But let's look at this. So if you look at Kanban, Kanban doesn't estimate your time at all. Bam, bam, bam. Kanban says, we don't care how long you think it's going to take. Now, I'm going to come back on this because Kanban does care how long it's going to take, and there are different ways of categorizing work and blah, 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 and we'll come back to that. But generally, with normal work, you're measuring the time it took to get through your cycle of work, right, through your workflow, to get from left to right. In other words, to go from in progress to done. You're measuring that. Now, if you want, you can measure the bit to the left, right? You can measure how long it was also sat there in, waiting, if you want. But generally, you're going to map in progress to done. And you're going to say, let's see how long that took. And then you can break that down into, like I said before, like maybe something like small, medium, large cards, right? But the cards are very much standardized to be as much the same size as you can, okay? And once you've done that a little bit, you get these sort of things like cycle time histograms and scatter plots, which show how long cards took. So like a scatter plot here, right down here at the bottom, you can see that this just says that like when they were completed, most of them would be, say, over a period of time from left to right. So you say, okay, so this number, like 9, I think it is, 10, sorry, they all were completed within, say, 12 days. Whereas these ones here above, that was 13 days, 14 days, 15 days, 16 days, 17, 18, 40 or whatever, right? And it just tells you how long they just all took. And what you can then do is, over time, is you can turn that statistically into an ability to estimate using data and facts and evidence rather than people guessing. So you go, well, hang on, over time then, we now are fairly confident that all tasks of that particular category and size, or size category, there's like an 80% chance that they're going to take that long. Now, if you think about it, that's a mind-blowing concept, isn't it? Rather than sitting down with your team and going, how long do you think that'll take? Oh, okay, you're late. But you said it was going to take 1 day, it's taken 5. Right, rather than all of that bollocks, you actually, and it does tend to be bollocks, let's be honest, you can actually just look and go, okay, data, maths. And then over time as well, you can do these Monte Carlo simulations, right? Now, Monte Carlo, if you haven't come across it before, it's pretty awesome. Monte Carlo simulation just runs statistics, a statistical profile on something or other hundreds of thousands of times. And then it comes up with these graphs. And what these sort of what they are is a distribution with probability. So they say, well, we've run Monte Carlo and we think that you can, let's say, for example, over 2 weeks, we reckon this many cards will get done, right? Or when the one, you might be, there's the median for how long it takes is this much because we've done a Monte Carlo simulation. And it just does those statistics for you. How does it do it? It just does it because of data, right? And then there's things like flow efficiency. So you can have your flow from left to right and you can measure how efficient you are at getting from left to right without any blocks. And the way you do that is you say, in a perfect world, really most pieces of work, in a perfect world, we reckon on average they are like 3 days long. And if the flow wasn't interrupted, if it was entirely perfect, including all the different phases, we reckon we can get from in progress to done in 6 days as the absolute bare minimum. If everything was perfect, everything, no delays. And then this flow efficiency is like, well, how many were done in 6 days? And so how long, what about, so most of them took 8 days. Why? And then what you do is you can go back and say, how can we improve that? And it could be you can never improve some things, right? I mean, you're never going to get 100% because it assumes a perfect world. And you don't need to get 100%. But if you can get anything above like 30 or 40%, then in some cases you'll be like, wow, that's good. Because, it just depends, right? Like a perfect flow assumes people are working all the time, for example, and there's no weekends or evenings or no one's ever on holiday and whatever else. So, but still, right, it gives you something. It gives you something to hang on to and go, this isn't done by just me making some stuff up and guessing. It's done with the team, like estimating. It's done just observing what happened. It's a it's a lag metric, isn't it? Like a lag metric is lagging behind, right? It's like a lag metric. You're historically looking back on data and saying, hey, data analyst, in this case, the data analyst is Kanbanize, right? Have a look at this thing. Give me some information here. Like, what's interesting. And what's interesting then becomes you don't have to ask for estimates. You can, if it's interesting, because there are different types of job. Like there's the standard job, which is just, I'm not going to ask you, but there is also other types of job. Like there might be a job which has got a set delivery date. There might be a job where it's being expedited, right? And then there's a real reason for trying to talk about estimation. Or it could be that your Kanban board isn't at the work level. It could be that you're a dev director and your Kanban level, your Kanban board is at the initiative level, right? Or is at the, pillars and features type level, in which case it might be useful for you to do a high level rough estimate. But of course, the more high level and rough it is, the more you're accepting that it's not that accurate because it's just rough, right? So if you say, well, I reckon, we got a whole game pillar here around combat with this particular type of combat, I don't know, like melee, and we got a whole bunch of features within it and system work and whatever. It's probably going to take, I don't know, phase one's probably going to take like 3 months. And you're like, oh, okay, 3 months, right? 3 months, that's a quarter. Okay, 3 months. You haven't said how many weeks, you haven't said how many hours or minutes, right? It's very rough. That's fine. You can do that kind of estimate, can't you? Because who cares? If you try and do that at every task level, you're just forcing people to make guesses which they're bad at. Why are they bad at it? Doesn't matter how long you've done it for. You can get more and more accurate at knowing how long your bit's going to be, but you're relying on other people, aren't you? Everything you do these days relies on other knowledge workers and other skilled people. And in many cases, very complex systems, and people understanding those systems and being able to insert the work you've done into them. And that means like queuing is so important. You cannot rely on yourself. You have to rely on everybody as a team working together, and then a whole bunch of service teams and a whole bunch of this and a whole bunch of that, right? It makes it much more complex. And then therefore, if you can step back and look at the data over time and go, oh, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because when we hand over to that shared services unit over there, if we do it, first half of the week, then it flows really fast. But if we do it the second half of the week, it takes an extra 3.5 days. It reveals the weirdest shit to you that you can then do something about, because it's continuous improvement. You start where you are, and then you say, what little things can we improve constantly, right? Not just on a every 2 or 3 week retrospective, but constantly. The entire team is dedicated to saying, that's stupid, let's do it better. Okay, and again, that comes from the Toyota production system, the Japanese system that said, you are all important. You can all help us improve. You, the workers on the factory floor, you know much more than the managers sat in an office, okay? And it's the same here. It's the team know a lot more than the bosses or even you as a producer might know, okay? Your job as a producer is never to tell a skilled knowledge worker, especially like the veteran knowledge worker, that they're completely wrong, right? And just overrule them. That's never really your job, is it? Not really. There are times, but they're going to be rare. The standard way of working is you respect those people and you respect their knowledge. If you use Kanban and you're not even asking them to estimate work, imagine the sense of relief when they talk to you, because you're not, what you care about is, well, what about the dependencies? What about, how can I help you with this, and who do you need to talk to? And does the workflow capture this accurately for you, or do we need to make any other improvements? And your job becomes more interesting and useful and valuable because you're not just wandering around saying, how are you doing on this? How many days are left? Right? Your whole mindset shifts to be more about being a useful servant leader. So, I just did a really quick whoosh through that, right? And there's so much more I could go over, but I wanted to kind of give you a really brief overview and then go into a lot more detail. We're 50 minutes in, and I think we'll just switch over to talk about queuing theory next and how powerful that is. So when we look at WIP limits, work in progress or work in process, What we're looking at there is the ability to stop work entering a column. Yeah. So, for example, we can stop more work entering the in progress. So that means that your team isn't overwhelmed. Why is that a good thing? I mean, intuitively, you know it's a good thing, but why is it a good thing? And it's because of queuing theory, and it's because of the studies that have been done into queuing, in which they have observed that if you follow certain guidelines and rules, you will move through a queue much faster if you put these limits in on each column where applicable and where appropriate. And in this case, it's by talking to the team and logically working out where these limits should go, right? And then observing them and then seeing if those limits are right. And then over time going, well, let's see, do we need to tweak some of these things? Again, continuous improvement, right? Everything can be made better and things change. But the queuing system theories will say to you, well, these WIP limits are really important because in a world where, you turn up to an airport and you try and check in and there's one desk waiting for you to check in, one check-in desk, and there's like 200 people waiting to go on a flight, and then there's 10 flights, so that's a lot of people, but there's only one desk. You go, well, that's a simple queue, isn't it? It's a queue in which every single person who arrives at the desk might take a short time, might take a long time, might be a nightmare, might be easy. If you then open up another desk and have two separate queues, what you've got there is the same thing split into two. What if you have one queue, but you have two desks so that you can be, if one desk is taking a long time, you at least can go to the other desk. What if there's 3 or 4 desks? Now, if you look at shops, especially large shops, if you look at, I suppose those of you who are in the colonies would call them malls and things like that, like these huge places, right? The queuing systems there are really interesting. Like if I go to my local Tesco's, God bless them, and I hear over the loudspeakers and the tannoy, everybody come and report to the checkouts, and we're opening more checkouts. And then 3 people arrive and open checkouts, and suddenly all the queues go away. What's happening there is that they're responding to the demand. And the more you can respond dynamically to the demand, the more you are understanding queuing theory. Because queues are natural, right? If you're at a shop, if you're at this Tesco place, which is a big grocery store, if you have one checkout, it could be times of day like 3 o'clock in the morning where that works just fine. There could be times of the day like Friday evening or early evening where it doesn't work very well at all. How do you control that? You open up more and then you close them again. How do you do that? By having a queuing system. The queuing system is dynamic. The queuing system responds at the appropriate point in the process, in the workflow. It says, at this point here, when people show up, is the point at which we are observing how many people are waiting. And when more than 8 people are waiting at a single queue, we open up another queue. It's probably less than that, right? We have rules. And Kanban has a lot of rules. Kanban says to move from left to right, we will have a rule. And that rule will say you are not moving from working into testing or from requested into in progress until you have met the rules, right? Until you have met what the rules tell you. So it could say you're not allowed to put work into progress until you have properly written down, say, I don't know, a whole bunch of fields have been completed. You've done the definitions of done properly. You've whatever, right? And the same in testing. You say, well, you're not moving to testing until you've got the test plans ready in advance and until blah, 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 right? Whatever. The same is true in queuing systems at airports and checkouts, right? Grocery checkouts. There's a set of rules because it just makes things a lot simpler. But those rules can happen at each stage, okay? The same when you're queuing at, say, Disney World. there are really sophisticated queuing theory rules in progress there that you probably don't even think about. But even telling you things like how long it's going to take you to get onto a ride is a direct result of statistically measuring how long, right? And using optimal queuing theory to try and make those queues as short as possible. Just the way they try and get you into a theme park or into some big attraction, the way they do the queuing with the way they arrange how you're going to filter through to get to a certain checkout and how you're assigned, and that's all scientifically proven to be the most optimal and efficient way to get work, or in this case people, through a system. Why? In their case, it's because people get really pissed off and they want to make as much money as possible with happy people and so on and so forth, right? It's the same with help desks, right, and call systems. Everything has now been very much optimized through these queuing systems and Kanban systems to say this is the most optimal way to do a thing. And if you think about it, it's all over the place now, right? Like if you go to in Britain anyway, if you go to a post office, it's still very antiquated. You queue and queue and queue, and if the person in front of you's got 12 parcels, that's it, you're dead, right? You're just going to wait there. If that was, say, a big grocery store, they would just open another till up, right? They'd open another booth up to serve you. And you see it all over the place. Things are getting better and things are changing. It takes advantage of this flowing of traffic, right? And traffic systems is another one. In fact, traffic systems is a really good one because the way that traffic is controlled at rush hour on big highways, especially where traffic is flowing in to the main highways, if you watch that, it's all using queuing theory, and it's using sophisticated theories which are statistically proven and do work. And you'll see a lot of it is about controlling average speed because that stops the concertina effect. The concertina effect where people slow down and speed up and slow down and speed up. And it also is the most efficient way to get work in the system. They control how many vehicles enter the system being the main highway. Okay, and it works. As long as people follow the rules, it works. All of which is applied in Kanban theory when we look at work in progress. Work in progress relies upon this system being obeyed, and it needs rules to say, before you can move from left to right, you must do this to move from this column to that column. This must have been done, okay? And that could be anything. It could be quality checking. It could be anything. It's up to you. Your team will tell you when you put these things together, because the way you put these things together is to sit down with the team and say, let's just map this out on a whiteboard. Like, what is the process of getting stuff done at the moment? Even that exposes a lot of problems that you can do something about. Queuing theory is hugely interesting. If you're a geeky loser like me, then you have whole books on this stuff, right? And I do. I don't necessarily understand all the statistics, but the main points kind of that I'm giving to you are incredibly interesting because they're almost counterintuitive until I give you real life examples, right? And I think a really great real life example is that traffic one. You do not want to release all cars into the main flow all at once, right? It's the same if you're in a car park and there's limited spaces in a multi-story car park and you say, right, there's 10 spaces left. And you go, right, well, okay, so we can let 10 cars in, but we're kind of relying on cars coming out as well, right? Now, if you make exiting a multi-story car park really hard, you're going to have a massive queue of cars trying to get out. And what's that going to do? It's going to stop the cars flowing in. So you've got to have an efficient way of not just stopping too much from getting into the system, but you have to have an efficient way of getting it through the system and getting it out of the system. Yeah. So you can see, like, if you start thinking about some of these things in real life terms, you can see that it actually has, in the last, like, several years, it has actually become much better and much more professional, if you will, how these things are now handled and the way that they are communicated as well. And it's very applicable for work, for this kind of software development work and game development work. It's very applicable. You do not want to have too much work in progress in your system because you're just a massive traffic jam. What you do is you keep it flowing by limiting how much you let in and by making it most effective how it flows through. I cannot possibly give you enough of an overview of this system just by talking to you right now. What I can do, hopefully, is whet your appetite. And then I would love it if you maybe came to this Kanbanize website where I am and just read it, right? And they got so many videos as well. But I just want to whet your appetite. So yeah, here we go. I've talked about flow efficiency, right? And I've talked about the fact that these bottlenecks will get exposed. But the WIP limits do that. The WIP limits, you see, if you've got the proper column breakdown, the WIP limits say, well, okay, we've got a bottleneck, haven't we? Because we can't move, right? We can't put anything else in this column and they're not moving. So we've got a bottleneck. And you can't really do that unless you've built your board to expose this stuff. So as soon as you have, and this, by the way, is one of the beauties, is that your board will change over time as your team asks you to add things, remove things, tweak things. As you do that, it exposes more and more potential efficiencies and effectiveness in the way that you can do things. If, by the way, if you are the environment artists, you can see here, it's really interesting, right? Because they might say, well, yeah, we can take more and more work in because everything is just sitting there waiting for it to be reviewed by the person in charge, and they're not reviewing it. But you should kind of go, well, yeah, but actually what we should do next is you should try and everyone should be trying to clear everything to done. So your job is to go to the person who's approving and say, well, you're not approving, and therefore you need to delegate that work to, say, 3 other people, and they just need to get on with it because you have completely stopped all work, right? And when you tell them you've completely stopped all work and we're not adding any more, then they got to do something about it. And that's where your leadership team needs to support you, because otherwise they're just rapidly causing this huge problem, like in a multi-story car park where they've just let too many cars in and they're not letting any out, right? So it reveals stuff like that. Yeah, and this thing about prevent multitasking is really interesting. It's a difficult one, really. It's like you can limit what they like to say here, the way Kanban Kanban, by the way, like Scrum, are assuming that teams stick together again, right? It's assuming like quite long-term teams. And I will cover that in one of the next sessions, like how we're going to make that work for you. But presuming that, they're saying, well, we know that people are less efficient if they're working on more than one thing at once because of context switching. So usually, right, you could say establish limits that stop multitasking, stop people like working on multiple things at once. And it's one of the really major efficiencies that you can gain where people are committed to doing one thing. Now, in reality, especially in games, there's quite a few people who are specialists and they need to be lent, right, between teams to do things. And they're kind of like I'm going to call them your elite rapid response teams, where you can have one person who knows how to do a thing that all 8 teams need from that person. So they are constantly being reassigned all over the place. But as long as the teams on the whole are have some longevity and have some stability, that can work very well in Kanban. And we can see how at another point. Deliver value faster. I mean, the more efficient your flowing is, right? The faster you're flowing work. What does that mean? That if you're flowing work, it means that you're getting things finished. And if they're done, it means that you've delivered value. because the only reason you're doing work is to deliver value, right? And the faster you can get things flowing through the system, the more effective that is, and the faster you're delivering value. So that's kind of WIP limits. Now, again, this is, I'm almost embarrassed because it's so surface level, this stuff. And, you know, I mean, I've got books sat here like Kanban Maturity Model, Product Development Flow, and others, Kanban. You know, there's so much here, but I just want to give you a little sprinkling, because already you've come across a system which can handle work in a way that's very different from Scrum, but has similarities which won't be too scary, can easily handle cadence. So if you want to, you know, if you want to do a report that says, well, tell me how much you did every 2 weeks, you can. It's up to you. And you can still have, the ability to use some of the ceremonies of Kanban, and we'll cover that in a bit, that reflect a lot of the Scrum ones, but they do it in a much lighter way. And you'll notice as well, we haven't been talking about roles here. There are no real roles in Kanban. You don't change any roles. You just are what you are already. Okay. The important thing is just to put it into a way that works. So this is, you know, Kanban's particularly favored by DevOps, and there's actually even a book which was kind of like okay, I'm going to skip that. I was about to get all clever. You're not going to care. But basically, DevOps is, you know, DevOps teams and IT teams, IT support teams, what they tend to have is they tend to have a whole bunch of work, like project work that needs to get done over time. And they also tend to have a whole bunch of requests that are coming in of various priorities. So they've got project work and they've got requests for help, right? And they've probably also got regular, say, monthly service maintenance type work they've got to do. A Kanban board can visualize that really easily across different swimming lanes, and it can do it as well by you know, scientifically helping you with prioritization, scientifically helping you with WIP limits and so on and so forth, in a way that means that teams, they don't have to guess. They follow rules, and the rules say, in this case, do it this way, and then in this case, pick that. And something like Kanbanize and very few other bits of software actually, but things like Kanbanize can give you all of those kind of data points so that it's more mathematical based upon data evidence than it is just personal opinion. And we have all, I'm sure, no, I'm not sure actually, but a lot of us have worked in places where personal opinion and the cult of personality is what drives priorities and decision making. Well, let's not do that very much, because it doesn't work, does it? And we know it doesn't work because most games are a fucking disaster and a horrible, chaotic mess of heartbreak and despair. So let's start using data, eh? So I'm going to cover, I'm not going to cover priorities. I know it's next on this list, but I'm actually going to go and look at some of the other interesting bits around Kanban, classes of service. But I think I'm just going to pause, but you won't notice. All right, just chumped down a bag of crisps and I'm back. So we're covering some of the details now because it gives you a really, really clear idea of why I'm personally deeply excited by Kanban. And you know, I'm just to say again, right, imagine a world, and you know, I did a video, you should watch it because, you know, it's brilliant, on estimating work. And in that video of estimating work, I actually said, I didn't tell you how to estimate work. What I kept saying was, what are the questions that you can ask, and how can you turn the process of talking about, you know, work and how long it's going to take, etc. How can you turn that into an information gathering exercise, and one for you as well as for the team members? And how can you make that an empowering experience? Imagine this world in which you're literally not asking people to estimate work, because you're saying, well, we don't really care what you think. Why would we care what you think? I mean, why would you, right? Because it's measured using data. You're just reporting on what happened. You're saying, well, over time, this kind of size task took this long. We don't really care what somebody thinks because we can see it, right? How exciting is that? Imagine the world in which you're not spending your whole time estimating work with people and driving them mad. Okay, that's a pretty exciting world, isn't it? Now, and it works, by the way. I mean, it's mind-blowingly simple and mind-blowingly complicated. So you have to be prepared to put some work into this, to put some effort into it. Just like with Scrum, right? You can't just establish an Agile Scrum team or an Agile Kanban team or an Agile Lean Kanban team. You can't establish those things without understanding what the hell they are. And I mean, you can, but they'll be as much of a disaster as everything else that you've done without really understanding why you've done it. If you do it properly, you will be, I tell you, you will be a star, right, in the universe. They'll be looking up at you from the planet at night and going, oh, our hero. Because if you do this right, I can tell you from experience, it bloody works, right? I'll tell you about my experiences later. But let's just move on because we've got a couple of things to cover. Right, so this one, how to manage risk with Kanban classes of service. Now, that sounds a very boring topic, right? Classes of service, why would I want to know about what the hell that is? Well, let's find out. Because classes of service are really, really powerful and useful and actually really simple. So what they do is they allow you to classify the type of work that something is, and that really empowers you to prioritize. So, for example, let's skip through some of the clever stuff here, right? But for example, we've covered expedite before, haven't we? We've said expedite is when you go, everybody panic, and that's expedite. But there's fixed date. So this is very practical, very pragmatic, these classes of service, right? Expedite is everyone's panicking, you got to fix it now. And fixed date, what's fixed date? Fixed date is, well, it's got to come out by then. It's got to be finished by then. Okay, good. We'll call that a fixed date class of service. Great. Now we know. Well, a fixed date class of service has to be the next priority. Because guess what? This table that you see here of 4 things is in priority order. So expedite, right? And it says for risk management, and you need to think about that because it's quite clever, but expedite's at the top, then it's fixed date, because it's a fixed date, standard, which is just the normal stuff, right? And at the bottom is intangible. What's an intangible? When you value a company, there are tangibles and intangibles. The tangibles are the things that you can get your hands on and see. The intangibles are the things that you can't quite get your head around, like culture, right? What makes a great company really successful? Culture, right? That's an intangible. You can't really touch it, can you? In the same way that knowledge workers who, you can't really touch them. You get in trouble with HR if you touch them. But intangibles are like the knowledge of the company, right? The knowledge of your team. But it's also things like the technical debt. It's things that don't necessarily deliver visible value, I should say. So let's say that I've worked in this situation before where you've had horrible tech debt stopping you from getting features out in time. The intangibles are, let's work on that. Let's fix those things. And you can say, well, but they're not delivering value directly to the customer, are they? They're actually speeding things up. You go, well, yeah, so it's an intangible. Now, so let's have a look at this, right? So expedite, here we go. Oh, sorry. Reserve for work items projects with a critical priority and a very high cost of delay. Right, we haven't talked about cost of delay, but maybe it's time we did, since we're here. Now, the cost of delay is what it sounds like. What would it cost to not do something? Cost of delay is a hugely interesting and important area which we're not going to talk about beyond making it sound a little bit simplistic. But it really is at a simplistic level, right? That if the cost of not doing a thing is enormous, you better do it. And if the cost of not doing a thing isn't very high, then it hasn't got a very high cost of delay, has it? So a really good example is I mean, at the moment, there's people at GDC in San Francisco, right? And maybe they had to get a game demo ready to show some potential investors, right? And you would say they're getting that demo out. Okay, I know it's not a task, but all the tasks around getting that demo out, right? You might argue there's a big cost of delay, because if the demo's not ready, there's no point everyone going to GDC and there's no demo to show. So that would say cost of delay. You would say the cost of delay is very high. On the other hand, if the demo's been packaged and is taken off and is being taken over to GDC, if you had like a little bit of minor work that you were going to do on it, the cost of delay on now doing it was like very low. So like, doesn't matter, is it? So there's a lot more to it than that, right? But that's the basics around cost of delay. And it's a really, really useful measure of should we do something? And if so, how urgently should we do it? Well, what's the cost of us not doing it, right? So the expedite class of service says it's going to have to be pretty damn important, right? It's going to have things like this: a huge risk for your project in which the cost of delay immediately increases exponentially. Really easy example. Again, you've got a live game and the service goes down, right? Like when you launch a new game and the whole thing goes boof, because suddenly you're hugely successful and you weren't expecting it. And what do? You have to go, oh my God, let's get in touch with our cloud service provider and we're going to have to scale the shit up. And oh my God, right, wake everybody up. And run around panicking. That's where the cost of delaying that, right? The cost of delaying doing that work to fix that problem increases, boom, because every minute that goes by, you've got a whole bunch of haters hating you more and a whole bunch of fans turning into new haters, and you've got to embrace that and go, we just got to fix this right now. And it's obviously therefore the most important thing, so it's expedited. Fixed delivery date. So it's slightly this one's, you got to be slightly careful, because people like putting delivery dates on things, right? They like putting a date on a thing when it doesn't really mean anything. So again, there's no point doing this unless you're going to do it properly. So look at it here, right? Assignments with a fixed date and a high cost of failing to deliver on time. Okay. Now, so there's a lot of, say with that demo that's being delivered for GDC, there's an argument there. There's a whole lot of tasks behind that which need to have a fixed date, right? But my example of expediting is that if the whole thing's not ready on time, you can't take it. So as you get nearer to that date, if you're falling behind, you might end up having to expedite stuff to get them done, right? But you've had plenty of warning, so you can see this stuff coming. But with fixed date, there has to be a reason for fixing the date. You don't just fix the date because you feel like it. And I've seen a lot of this, like with delivery managers and project managers and producers, where they fix dates. And sorry, I shouldn't just pick on you. This is also true of EPs and leads and directors and owners of companies, right? Is they just create dates for the hell of it because they think it'll help put the team under pressure. Now, I don't know about you, but I think the team's under enough pressure already. Oh God, that's hot. So, if your team's under enough pressure, I said this as well. I remember saying this around the estimations video. It's like, for Christ's sake, just find out why, right? Why does that have to be delivered by that date? And I bet you in a lot of cases, if you're not in a very mature company, they'll go, oh, just to make sure it gets done. and that's not a good answer, right? That's not a good reason to having a fixed date. A fixed date is things like the demo example, the ye olde days, you'd say an E3 demo. God knows if we're going to have any of those again. But real milestones, real important reasons to say, well, we've promised an early access release to like 500,000 people are waiting for it, right? They're really keen, and we've got a date and we can't really miss it because we've paid already for a whole bunch of marketing, etc. So fixed date, make sure it's a proper fixed date, right? Make sure it's a reason for it to be a fixed date. There are some great examples which are not necessarily game making related. It kind of depends, right? But there might be an opportunity, say in mobile, where if you can get a certain thing out by a certain time, you get a much better margin, right? You just make more money, or you save a lot of money. There could be deadlines on some sort of service or support or whatever, where it makes perfect sense, right? So, I mean, they got a good example here. You have to deliver the drawings by blah, otherwise you risk being switched to another company, right? I mean, that's a pretty big one, right? It's like they won't use you anymore. I mean, that's a big one. And, outside the games industry, because the games industry is very much like a bubble. It's like, oh, we've been funded to make a game, let's just get on with it. And there's a whole degree there of unprofessionalism compared to a lot of businesses that are held really accountable, very strongly accountable for milestones and dates and forecasting accuracy and things like that. Okay, so you have to, again, there's a lot around cost of delay, there's a lot around little graphs like this, right, and what they mean, but we're not going to cover all of those right now. But you get the point, right, that if somebody has told you there's a fixed date, for God's sake, ask them why. Because you must use it correctly, or all the data that you're measuring, right, and the class of service, because there's another class of service, and the prioritization, because remember, this is prioritization, this is your prioritization list, if you will, it's just going to be wrong, okay? So, standard. So, standard is just everything. Right, moderate cost of delay, they can tolerate a long lead time, they don't require much prioritizing, like it says there. And this is, so, if you are those artists in making environments and you've got, someone's just dropped another 300 bits of work at you, or you've broken it down, right, into 300 bits of work, and you just need to do it, that's just standard. Now, it could be that there's a subset of that work which needs to be done for a certain date, because some level builders are relying on it being a certain quality, right? In which case you have a subset of work which you can categorize as one and say, there's a fixed date around this lot, okay? And it could be all your work's like that and needs fixed dates. It could be that it doesn't really matter. It could be you just need to get it done, right? In which case that's just standard. It is favorable, it's preferable that everything's standard, right? I mean, that's why it's called standard, isn't it? You should, because this is a prioritization system, right? It reflects risk. Things should only really be above standard if there's a risk attached to them, and that could be a cost of delay. So intangible. We've talked about this a little bit, right? It says here things like chores. Chores. I mean, it's particularly true in stuff like DevOps, where there's a whole bunch of work you need to do in the background just to keep things running or to make things a bit better. I mean, I remember when I was working in DevOps and we would have discussions around the priority of working on some major project for the VP of Tech versus migrating to the latest version of a database because it would have slightly improved performance, and also in 12 months' time, the old version wasn't going to get supported according to the SLA that you had, and you had to say like, well, what priority is that then compared to everything else? And it's pretty much an intangible. Okay, they've got long lead times that you can wait. If something else comes along, it's the kind of thing that can be done when you're waiting for other work. Those intangibles can be moved along rather than dragging stuff in of like standard. You go, well, this intangible stuff needs to get done. The thing with intangibles is this little bit of graph here, right? That if you don't do them ever, there's a point in which it suddenly goes whoosh, because suddenly they become like a fixed date thing. Like, I mean, you see this particularly with like engineering teams when they, a good example is like Unreal Engine 5.1 comes out and everyone goes, okay, well, that'll be interesting. We need to upgrade to that. But when we're upgrading to that, everyone's going to need to sit there and wait for us to do that. And we're going to need to work out what it is that we've just gained and if there's any bugs. And we might have to redo a whole bunch of stuff and run a bunch of scripts. And like you can say that's an intangible, right? But there comes a point where you really do need to do it, in which case it then almost becomes, back up here, it almost becomes a fixed delivery date or even an expedite if you realize that you've made a mistake by not upgrading in time. And there's other great examples on, say, mobile, again, where you know that you have to support certain legal changes, let's say, like certification and compliance. But let's say you've got 6 months to go. And rather than making that a fixed date, which you might argue is logical, you might say, well, we have to have it done by then, so let's make it a fixed date. Remember, fixed date's a priority. Fixed date is not just about the date, it's about the cost of delay. So you might say, well, let's just have it as an intangible for now, right? But when we review this every month or every 2 weeks, there'll come a point where we're going to move it up in priority, okay? And that, of course, requires you to know, like, roughly how big the work, how much work there is to do, and right, the likely impact and things like that. Now, that's just the guidelines, custom classes of service, right? So you can make whatever you want. So like it says here, it's common to define a fifth class called bugs, usually placed between fixed delivery and standard. That's interesting, isn't it? Placed between fixed delivery and standard. I mean, that's quite high priority, isn't it? Why? Because there's a whole world of evidence that says you should be working on your bugs as they appear. You shouldn't be waiting for like 3 months to go by and then just jumping on 1,000 bugs. You need to keep the quality of your software, your game high. And to do that, you need to fix bugs as you go. Bugs lower quality and they slow you down, and they can reveal something nasty in the future if you don't deal with them now. So along with like lean, product development flow says this, lean software development says this, right? Even the way that Kanbanize does their own work, they push this as well. They say, fix your bugs early and fast, because then they don't get any worse. As you know, I'm making a sweeping statement here, right? But it's something that a lot of research suggests is extremely important. So, but yeah, there's others that you can use. You can use your own classes of service. You might have a whole bunch of different ones because, we are, after all, making games, and the way we do things might require this stuff to be changed. But if you're in a quite well-established sort of DevOps IT sort of world, this is probably good enough, right? And you'll probably have swimming lanes of projects versus requests, and you'll prioritize requests above projects to a degree, and blah, 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 right? The whole DevOps Kanban model is very well documented across the internet and in books and all that. So as classes of service, now let's look at replenishment. Okay, now in Scrum, you have your planning ceremonies, don't you? And you have your backlog refinements, in which you look at the priority and order of things, okay? So Kanban replenishment is where you replenish the team's pipeline. And the pipeline is that backlog, right? That work that's waiting to be done. You replenish it. You say, well, is it still the right list? Is it still the right thing? Because there's a natural priority, which is the things at the top is where you should be pulling them. If it's higher up, it's higher priority, right? So you go, what should I pull next? The thing at the top. Okay, I'll have that. Now, is that the right queue? So regularly, and that regularly might be weekly or monthly, depends on the level of your board, but regularly you do that. You replenish. You say, right, is this still right? Is this still correct? Are we still focusing on the right things? Now, it's like, when do you do that, and how often you do it very much depends upon your team and your relationship to others. And, it could be that you're a co-dev partnership and you're working for another company and they keep sending you more work, and it becomes very important that you prioritize things properly. And it might be that they pull a whole feature and you need to remove a whole bunch of stuff, right? And things like that. So, yeah. So, there's like it says, there's a replenishment commitment point on this one where you've got the backlog, and then before it goes to ready to start, you make absolutely sure, right? You have a replenishment commitment there. But it depends. It depends on how, you're doing stuff in your team. And I have learned more and more recently that so many companies now, games companies, are doing work for others, or are like a subset of a more creative group, or don't have the authority that they need to really do some of this stuff properly. But replenishment is pretty straightforward, right? It's like replenishment is a thing where, I mean, you can see there's a lot to it, but replenishment is this thing where you say, are we doing the right work, right? And while we're at it, is there anything else that we need to fix? So it really, there's a lot of detail I could go into about replenishment, just like if you were to look at the backlog refinement, there's whole books about it, right? But let's just keep it simple. Let's just say that there's replenishment that you can do. I mean, there's upstream and downstream discussions that we could have here about things that are upstream from you. And that's what I mean about the third parties that are paying you to do something, let's say, right? Or maybe you're paying them to do something and they're downstream. But where there's stuff that's upstream, stuff that's downstream, there's a whole replenishment sort of discussion to be had there as well. And what have things changed? Like, do we need to refine stuff? Do we need to blah, blah, blah. So replenishment is just, again, very interesting. There's a lot to it, but let's just assume that it's like backlog refinement, right, for now. But it starts us talking about the fact that people often say that Kanban has no roles, has no ceremonies, how the hell do you know what's going on, has no cadence. That's simply not true. You can have cadence if you want, and you can have ceremonies if you want, and in fact it's encouraged. And particularly when you scale up Kanban, it's encouraged, right? But you can have things like a service delivery review. You can have, I mean, this guy here, right? 7 Kanban cadences. Let's have a look. So it encourages you to do things like a risk review, right? Monthly, maybe. A delivery planning meeting, maybe, right? A daily meeting, which is almost exactly the same as a daily stand-up. But it's you start at the right-hand side of the board and you say, what can we pull to the right from the left? Service delivery review weekly, an operations review monthly, a strategy review quarterly, if that's where you're using Kanban, a replenishment and commitment meeting. How often? Depends, right? So, there's these different meetings and different ways of doing things, and it just kind of depends upon what works for you, okay? But, a service delivery review is kind of like a retro, and you can read this, right, if you're interested. It's kind of easier telling you guys about Scrum, because I know most of you have done Agile Scrum courses, whereas hardly anybody has done any official Kanban courses. I mean, if you have, you're probably like, face palming at me saying some of these things, but if you haven't, it's very difficult for me to go into too much detail without knowing I'm going to burn your brains. But yeah, so anyway, there's loads of things that you can do. There's loads of reviews where you can look at your data, right? You can analyze your data. There's loads of types of review you could be doing there where you say, oh, look, we could do some improvement here. And again, remember, it's all about continuous improvement, right? It's all about sitting with your team and going, what works and what doesn't work? What can we do better? And I think that's a really important place to sort of pause and maybe stop for now. I'll give you an example. The pauses, I want to give you an example of how I've used Kanban in a simple example, in a simple format. So I have been like an Agile consultant before, where I've implemented Kanban, I think twice, to different teams who requested it, right? And then in another case, well, no, it was in one of those cases, I actually went to them and said, the way you're working, really, being that you're an IT DevOps team, you would benefit greatly from moving over to Kanban, because that's the best practice for your type of team, and it will help you harness the chaos of getting requests in, regular work and projects, and how to prioritize them, using classes of service, using prioritization, using WIP limits, etc. And the way that you do Kanban, right, is that you stand there at a whiteboard with the team and you say to the team, right, just tell me how things work, right? How do you get some work in? Where's it come from? How do you know what it is? What kind of information do you get? What happens next? Okay, and then what you do is, as they're talking, is you start to visualize it in the form of columns, what you would put on a card, and then you'll say things like, oh, okay, so you get a request in to make a feature. Sorry, that's not a good example. Let's say you get a request in to come up with some character art, and you go, okay, so who does the request come in from? Okay, so what questions do you ask them? Like, let's formalize it. What do you need to know before you say, yes, okay, we're ready? And just by asking that question, you'll find that there's no formal answer, but the whole team will get together and say, well, actually, it would be really good if we knew that. And, well, I always ask them this thing. And, well, you ask them that, but they never get the right answer. It would be better if you ask them this. And that whole team discussion, right, is a continuous improvement example, because it generates the end result of rules, right? It says, well, there's a request form now, isn't there? Now we know we need a request form. So people have to fill out this request, or we can go and talk to them, right? We can just go and get that. We can just talk them through it and they can tell us and we can fill it in. But until we've done that, we're not going to move it to the next column, right? So you go, okay, great. There's a thing happening just right there. And then you can go, okay, so tell me about your art workflow. Like, how's this going to work? And it could be that once I'm going to give some very vulgar, not vulgar exactly, but sort of a brutalistic example, not a very sophisticated one. But let's say the next thing that happens is it goes to a concept artist or something, and they have to come up with some ideas, and through using your well, it doesn't matter, does it? But let's just say it goes to concept and then it comes back and whatever. And then you can build that view out and you can say, well, does it always go to concept, or are there going to be times where it doesn't need to? And they go, oh yeah, actually, yeah, it can go this way. And you can map that flow out, right, using like columns and subcolumns, and again the rules. So you can go, well, it's going to skip that one if this is true, or it's going to have to go to that extra one if this is true, right? It's just flow chart. It's columns that are linked by an invisible flow chart, and the flow chart are the rules, okay? And those rules are what makes it so interesting. You do not simply move cards. You say, what are the rules for moving the cards? Like what do you mean you go from like finishing thing to a certain quality, you send it to this person over here? Well, how do you know it's that quality? What is it that you have to fulfill? What are the criteria? And then it becomes incredibly interesting and a real learning experience for everybody involved. But again, please don't do this. Don't walk up and do this with someone until you've got a real grounding. Now, I mean, I've done this as a consultant, so I've actually gone to companies and done this for teams, right? And I've done it fully remotely as well, and all this sort of thing, and done workshops and whatever. So I'm pretty confident, even though I might sound like I don't know what I'm talking about because of the rambling I've done in the last hour and a half. But I do know what I'm talking about, and I can tell you now that when you do that per team, it's quite laborious, right? I mean, you're doing it per team, and it's really interesting because you realize that teams do things in different ways, and that actually it's why we producers have got a real job on our hands, because you get to, if you're looking after 3 teams, let's say, you get to do it with each of them, but each time you do it, you know more, and each time you do it, you can also reflect on what the other teams have told you. And then when you've done it for all of them, and then other producers have done it, and you all come together, you can then reflect upon, oh, how did everyone else do it, and how can we improve? And oh, let's steal that idea. That's a great idea. And oh, maybe we should have a group meeting where we all get together and present, right, what our flows are, and we can all talk about it. There's huge amounts of possibilities which you simply don't get with Scrum, okay, which is a problem-solving methodology, isn't it? It's like, we need to get loads of information as quickly as possible back to solve problems. Kanban says, well, I don't give a shit if you've got any problems. All we're doing is breaking work down flowing it across the system, blah, 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 right? Now, what I haven't mentioned is with the work in progress limits and the way that you put in tasks, etc., right, is and the flowing of work is that you break work down to as small as you can get away with without it being stupidly small. And this is scientifically proven to make you more effective as a team, to help this flow system work better, to everything needs you to break work down into small units. How small? Well, you don't want to break them down into well, firstly, I need to pick up my pencil. Not that you have pencils, you modern people. So firstly, I need to put my fingers on a keyboard, and then I need to press the keys. You need to agree, right? You need to go, well, what's the smallest amount of detail that we can get away with here? And the idea there is you want things to flow through pretty quick. You don't want huge pieces of monolithic work flooding your systems and just sitting there for months, right? Really, I would say, look for like 1 to 3 days, maybe 1 to 5 days, depending on the level of the board. And when I talk about level of board, by the way, I mean, a lot of you are going to be at team level, but some of you are going to be at initiative level, are going to be looking at feature flows and things like that. It's just a different world, right? Which we're not going to cover in any detail now, but I can do later. But yeah, so you need to look at your board, you need to look at the flow, and you need to break work down into small enough pieces that it's not over detailed, right? But that it's detailed enough that you can go, yeah, I get that. And, maybe 1 to 5 days is enough. And anything bigger than that, you kind of need to break it down more. Now, I said we don't do estimates, but you can kind of guess if something's 1 to 5 days in your head, and then maybe class it as small, medium, or large, right? Maybe small's 1 day or less, and medium is like maybe 2, 3, 4, and 5 pluses. 5 is large. But again, these things just need to be explored over time. And the only reason for doing the small, medium, large is for data, so that you can get reporting on it, right? And you can then use your Monte Carlo simulations and things like that. So all of that stuff's really interesting and important. We haven't really covered this final section here on prioritization. It's assumed that things that are at the top are the highest priority in any board. So if it's at the top, so if you look at this, right, this one here is your top priority because it's at the top, right? And it's ready to start. I mean, okay, but in this column, it's your top priority, okay? In this backlog, the PC19 virus check is a higher priority than the server utilization, okay? You can see in the examples here, they're very DevOps based. So you need to reflect that in the way you do things, right? It's a very easy thing to look at because you can go, oh, okay, what should I do next? The thing that's at the top. Now, a lot of you are familiar with that, right? From Scrum days of having backlogs where somebody goes, oh, I've finished my work, what should I do now? And you go, oh, what's at the top? So it's just the same thing. But that's why it needs review and it needs reflection and it needs replenishment, etc. Right? So you need to make sure those things that are at the top are at the top. And then you pull your tasks in. So you can do it with columns. So here you've got them given examples of like waiting for approval, waiting for review, waiting for external activity, where it breaks it into more detail so that you can have even more prioritization happening across that workflow as well, right? Where you can have, waiting for approval, you can decide what the most important things are that need to get approved next by putting them at the top. Or you can prioritize with swim lanes. You can use the visual cue of saying expedites is at the top because it's the top priority, then normal, and then low. I don't think that's a great idea personally. I don't think that works very well. But in some organizations, it does work for them. But I think you can use classes of service to better effect personally. But that's just me. And then like the backlog itself, right? Putting things at the top. And you can break the backlog down. This is interesting for some of us, right? This is really useful. So things like here, they've got a backlog of which quarter you need something in, right? So if it's Q1 and Q2, say you're in Q, I don't know, Q4 the year before, and Q1, that's probably going to be the next thing you need to pull. And things just move over, right, from when you think you're going to need them roughly. But you could do whatever you wanted here. You could break that down however you felt like it. Oh yeah, color indicators to reflect your classes of service. That's very normal indeed. Really, in the oldie days, when I was stood around whiteboards, we would use colored cards, and it was all very, physical cards and physical boards. And you just wrote like red expedite. As you're building up this huge version of how they work, you start doing all this stuff as well. And I can't tell you how rewarding that is, by the way. Standing with a team and doing that stuff and building this board up is an incredible, invaluable team bonding experience in which you finally get to feel really useful, because you're like, wow, I've sat here for 3 hours and these guys don't even want to leave. They don't even want a loo break, right? They're just really excited because they realize that this is the first time that anyone's actually asked them what they do and how they do it. And that even the people on the team didn't know that somebody did something, or didn't know there was a way of doing it much quicker. And it's, for example, and it just becomes so powerful and exciting because they realize they're being encouraged to do this continuous improvement as well, right? They're not just being measured because, we're spying on people and we want data to, blame them or something. They're actually being measured because we want them to be able to improve. But part of like that agile philosophy around owning the work and, just feeling like you're more in control. I imagine what happens when you sit with a team and say, okay, what do you think? What is the flow for you and how can we do it better? They've instantly been involved, right? Their expertise, their opinions, everything engaged. Brilliant, just brilliant. So anyway, this is a kind of a, I called it flow your boat gently down the stream because I'm hilarious when I was first talking about what we would cover next. But I wanted to just talk about this flowing, right? This flowing that requires WIP limits, that requires engaging the team in what the process actually is, not what you think it is. And just talking about the bare minimums that you need to just even start to understand Kanban. But what I really want you to take from this is, what about a world in which you don't have to estimate? That's a good world, isn't it? But Kanban can handle the chaos of requests coming in, because all you're going to do with them is give them a class of service. It can handle the way you prioritize through different ways, right? Like you can use cost of delay. You can use, like they do this in Scrum as well, you can use weightest, shortest job first, in which there are different prioritization techniques, right? They're just techniques. If you're at a high level, like an initiative level, you can even use things like Moscow, right? Like must have, could have, etc. There's loads of different things, right? I don't want to cover that because there's actually a section here called Portfolio Kanban if you're interested. But the other thing we haven't talked about is that Kanbanize, amongst very few others. I'm not trying to sell Kanbanize, by the way. Well, I am, because I've become a partner with them, but I'm not trying to sell it to you. What I'm saying is Kanbanize is one of the very few where it can visually map like a feature and the work that's broken down in separate Kanban boards and automatically track progress, and then have that feature maybe mapped up to a higher level and then mapped up to a higher level. And, you can go all the way up to your sort of whole portfolio of stuff that needs to get done, all of which can be then analyzed through data. I'm just saying all of that stuff, I don't even want to cover that with you now, but I will, because I'm going to talk about scaled agile, scaled Kanban, scaled Scrum type things next-ish. I say next-ish because I really want to spend more time talking about flow and some of the science behind this as well. But I guess I'll just see where it goes. So I guess I found this was quite sprawling. I was quite intimidated on how to cover this, like I said at the beginning, because it's a really difficult topic, because I guess, if you know too much, there's a real danger to cover things that you find particularly interesting in too much detail. So I guess I could do with your feedback, really. I mean, this has been a long session, right? An hour and 15 minutes. So I'm sorry about that. But I find this very exciting, because I find that if you're in games, and let's say your job is that you're leading teams which make content, right? In a live game, you're doing season content, let's say. You know, so many games now have this huge amounts of people working in live ops in terms of like events, content, like I said, like seasonal things, tweaking of features and whatever. Really, that is just sat there waiting for Kanban, right? And just a world in which you're not estimating because you have this system supporting not estimating just frees you up, man. It frees you up to do so many other things, right? But again, you have to understand Kanban properly before you can do it. Okay, so if this has excited you at all, if you've got all like hot and flustered, tell me. But maybe come here and have a look. Maybe go to some other places, right? I mean, I've got so many links to Kanban stuff. I mean, and I can tell you about books you could read. A really obvious one is Kanban by Anderson. I mean, he started it all in terms of software and like Kanban. There's a great book called Personal Kanban by Jim Benson. Really great book for your, like, that's what it says on the tin, right? Personal Kanban. There are even books called things like Why We Need WIP Limits and things like that, right? Just like little books. And I mean, I don't suggest that you buy the book I've got on my desk, which is the Kanban maturity model. You probably don't need that. But you can tell I'm a fan. It doesn't mean to say that I'm, fanatical about it. It just means that it gives me an extra arrow in my quiver, right? And I was going to make an arrow in the knee joke, and I couldn't get my head to do that. But it doesn't mean to say that there isn't a place for Scrum and hybrid and waterfall, because there absolutely is. But, I think we need to think about these things and where to apply them. And I do want to spend some time talking to you next as well about not just the scaling, but the assumptions we make around the phases like pre-production and production, and if they're still useful, because a lot of it comes from the movie industry, which we're not in, unless you're The Last of Us. So that'll do. Love you all. I'm sorry if this was a bit weird. I felt it was a bit weird. But maybe it's just because I wasn't using my usual Miro stuff. But let me know what you thought. And I'll just carry on until somebody stops me. So take care. Bye for now. Ciao.